Perhaps let's just touch base with our business editor, Xolani Mbanjwa, who is in Cape Town. A very good afternoon to you, Xolani. What are the sentiments post the minister's presentation of his budgets? Before this, we were speaking to various stakeholders, and they were outlining what they were hoping that the minister would be focusing on this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Really, I'm going to get to most of the parties now, starting with the Freedom Front Plus's voter Wessels on his views about this particular budget. Mr. Wessels, thank you very much for joining us. Some of the surprises that were contained in the budget, your thoughts, please.
Well, I think it's completely unacceptable that there's once again bailout money given to SAA whilst we are in this crisis. It's also clear that South Africa is in a crisis, that our debt is increasing, that our service cost on that debt is increasing, and I think the minister put it very well by saying we owe a lot of money to a lot of people, and that is disconcerting.
And your thoughts about the turning back on the 40 billion rands that they wanted in taxes, what do you think, sir?
Well, it would have been detrimental to the economy if there were any tax increases at this stage. We actually need more tax relief because the only way to stimulate economic growth is by, at the end of the day, providing tax relief so that in the long term, more people are employed, more people have spending power, and more people can get the economy going. So that is positive. There is a little bit of relief for private individuals with regards to bracket creeping, but not enough. And then the increases on levies and increases on excise duties, that is detrimental to the economy, especially with regards to the road accident fund. That's completely unacceptable. The road accident fund is bankrupt, and now we're still funding it, and individuals are now going to pay more for products, for driving around, for actually occupying or spending money in the economy, and that won't actually serve its purpose.
Thank you very much, Mr. Voter Wessels. Let me move on, Tammy, to the ANC coming right from this particular budget speech, and we're going to hear from the Secretary General, from Treasurer General of the ANC. Sir, thank you very much for your time. Your thoughts on this particular budget, which has been touted as the most critical in the country?
Well, on behalf of the ANC, I want to say we are happy with the budget. More resources have gone to education, especially higher education. So, as the minister said, the students going to universities will get support. So we are happy with that. More resources have been made to provinces to be able to continue the fight against COVID, especially the rollout of the vaccines. So we are happy with that as well. More resources going to infrastructure, expanded public works programs to create employment, particularly amongst young people. So as the ANC, we welcome the budget. We think under the circumstances, it's a good budget. We know that the minister said there is loss of revenue of 200 billion that we will under-collect, but we are happy that with the little resources that are there, they've been allocated to the rightful places.
So one of the issues that are in this particular budget, which is quite important, is the promise of the debt levels being stabilized at around 88% in 2025. If you look at the past couple of years, there has been a lot of rising in debt and concerns about that rise. Do you think South Africa can pull it off? And what else do you need? Do you think the kind of support that Mr. Tito Mboweni needs to actually see this through?
Well, I think we should pull it off. And as the minister indicated that he wants us to move to a level where there is surplus in the budget, because that will allow for proper economic growth. So it means we're going to need a lot of prudent spending, fiscal discipline, and all those things. So implementation, yes, but has to be within the fiscal framework that the Minister has explained that should lead us by 2024 to a surplus budget and stabilizing our debt level situation.
And lastly, Mr. Mashatile, something that is quite important. South Africa's rollout of the vaccine is on everybody's lips. There are so many concerns about it. Over 10 billion rands has been allocated over the next 2 years, which suggests that our vaccine rollout is going to take more than 2 years. What do you make of that particular undertaking by the minister?
Well, I think it's the 10 billion rand is quite an extensive allocation. I guess once we start with the rollout, we will improve our situation. It may well be that we might even reach more people even before the 2 years, but I think the minister wanted to start somewhere, and I think we should welcome that.
Thank you very much there, Mr. Paul Mashatile, the Treasurer General of the African National Congress, saying that they are quite happy about this particular budget and saying that it's something that is going to spur on the economy, according to the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Let me move on, Tami, to the Deputy President, Nkosi Buthelezi, who is with me right now. We spoke to you earlier, sir, about what were your expectations on this particular budget. Tell us what you think about these particular allocations now.
Yeah, from our expectation, as we said in the morning, I think the minister delivered to some extent a very measured budget. It's got both things that we appreciate and also things that we are very much concerned about. For example, the fact that there will be 11 billion that will be allocated for government youth employment, and also the 4 billion that will go to local economy. Those were the things that the IFP actually expected, and the fact that there will be no tax increases, we appreciate that very much. But on the other side, there's something that are very concerned, the minister mentioned, but in a very low tone. The issue of government debt, which is forever increasing. Now it's going for over 5 trillion. The issue of the wage bill, which is a serious problem. And we were also surprised that the minister didn't speak much about the issue of SOEs. Yet we know for a fact that there will be monies that will be allocated to state-owned entities like South African Airways, but he chose not to say anything about that. So those are the things that we are worried about. But in all honesty, he was very measured, and we appreciate him in the fact that the grants will be increased, but that is not much money because he spoke about 10 rands here, 10 rands there, 8 rands here, 8 rands there, which is not much of a money. So, but at the end of the day, half a loaf and no bread.
Do you trust the fact that we are going to get a surplus in 2025, just like the minister has promised?
We only hope, as he spoke about hope, you know, because unless government puts so much emphasis in terms of people accounting, then it's only then, and if we do not keep all these inefficiencies that he spoke about, inefficient in local government, in almost all spheres of government, there are fruitless expenditures, there are wasteful expenditures because of people who are in the system but who shouldn't be there. And also when it comes to the wage bill, they are proposing that there should be some salary cuts, of which we oppose as IFP. We're only saying that let them do the audit and see that those departments that are overstaffed, they transfer staff to those departments that are actually understaffed. If there are new vacancies, they must look from within to see how can they place those people.
Thank you very much. That is the IFP Deputy President, Nkosi Buthelezi. And I will move on quite quickly to the DA's Shadow Minister for Finance, that is Jordan Hill-Lewis. Jordan, you spoke to us earlier about your expectations, and I was looking at the reaction from your benches, and you were not clapping, you seemed unimpressed. What is it that is so unimpressive about this particular budget by Tito Mboweni?
Well, I think that if you are recently unemployed in South Africa or you're living on a social grant, you must be really unhappy with this budget. We are actually, for the first time that I can ever remember, seeing cuts to social grants over the next 3 years. We are seeing higher taxes on petrol, which means that food will go up, taxis will go up, bus fare will go up. So the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable in our society are bearing the brunt of this budget. And who's winning? Another bailout for SAA. Another bailout for Eskom, and another one for the Land Bank. This is unacceptable. How long will this continue? So again, the DA has been warning about this for several years now. Critical social spending is being cut with social grants for the first time and more bailouts again and again.
What do you make of the promises to actually get a surplus by 2025 and actually make sure that we roll out the vaccine program within the next 24 months and that particular allocation that they've announced today?
Two very important points there. First on debt and the surplus. Obviously we welcome that commitment. We wonder, is it possible? And we're going to hold the minister to it. Because of course it relies entirely on whether the minister can get agreement with public sector unions. If you can't get agreement, that target is out the window. So we're going to be watching that very carefully. We wonder how credible it is. On vaccines, that was another area of disappointment because there's only 4.5 billion rand budgeted for this year for vaccines. Now, if you look at those numbers, that means it's not enough for even less than half of South Africans to get vaccinated, which means we're going to still be waiting for vaccines next year and even the year after that. That is too slow. We've got to get back to normal, and the only way we can do that is by vaccinating everyone as soon as possible.
And the commitments to actually support the youth jobs program and additional 11 billion rands, taking it to 100 billion rands. Do you think that is enough? Do you think it will ever be enough, though?
Well, I'm afraid that that is just fluff that is meant to distract people from the real story in this budget. And the real story here today is that if you are poor in South Africa, the government has just really kicked you while you are down. And that is unacceptable. And they're doing that on the back of bailouts to zombie state-owned companies. Every person should find that totally morally repugnant. I certainly do.
Thank you very much for your time. That is Jordan Hill-Lewis from the Democratic Alliance, the Shadow Minister for the DA and for Finance. And we're actually speaking now to the Good Party that is largely placed here in the mother city of Cape Town. Sir, thank you very much. We caught up earlier about this particular budget. What do you make about this particular budget that sets it apart from the previous ones?
So I think for me the budget was a budget of both hope and despair. There were some glimmers of hope in the budget, and amongst those is that there is funding provided for the COVID-19 vaccine program. I hope it is sufficient. I was expecting a much larger number than the 10 billion rand over 2 years. But of course it depends on what the price of each dose of vaccine is, whether that will achieve the 67% of the adult population being vaccinated in the next year. So that was a glimmer of hope. The other part that was hopeful was that the tax brackets, personal tax brackets, have been revised to bring some relief to lower and middle income earners, and that so there was no tax increase in order to fund the vaccination. The despair for me was that the minister had made commitments last year to stabilizing our debt in 2023, 2024, peaking at 87% then, and now it's 89% in 25, 26. And of course, we were promised a surplus in 2023, 2024, and this has been moved to 2025, 2026. The other area that is really concerning me is the extension of the social relief grant, the temporary social relief grant. That has now been extended to the end of April. That cannot be sufficient. I was hoping to hear that grant would extend until such time as this government could put in place a basic income grant, because we cannot expect millions of South Africans to live every single day without access to any income.
Would you have added anything or altered anything that the minister said, particularly when it comes to the wage bill, kicking it down the road? Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen with the negotiations in particular, which are currently, as you said, ongoing.
So the negotiations are ongoing, and of course that is part of the democratic process in South Africa, where employers and employees negotiate around wages. I'm pleased and support the commitment to a just process and a just and equitable public compensation regime. But I think we must also look beyond just the cost of the public service, but also to wastage, leakage, and corruption. So if we're going to reduce costs in order to find more funding in our budget, it's not just about reducing the wage bill, but there are other sectors where we can look to find some savings, and that is wastage and leakage. I think the other thing that I would have liked to have heard was a very firm commitment about the role of electricity supply in stabilizing our economy and in growing our economy. We can talk about the growth of the economy and the financial future of South Africa, but we can't do so without understanding whether we're going to stabilize our electricity supply and whether we're going to end load shedding. And although it's not this minister's responsibility to address load shedding, I would have liked to have heard how that plays a part in his plan.
Thank you very much for your time. That is the Good Party actually giving us its thoughts about the good and the bad when it comes to this particular budget. And up next, we'll be talking to Mr. Wayne Trin, who is from the ACDP. And we are going to be hearing from the ACDP. Mr. Trin, what do you make of this particular budget that is coming up at a very, very tough time for South Africa?
Well, certainly the ACDP understands that globally as well as locally we are under depressed economic circumstances. But the ACDP warned as far back as April last year that the hardest lockdown in the world possibly, was going to have negative consequences and affect the livelihoods of South Africans. And so the ACDP feels vindicated because what we've seen is increased unemployment rates of some, right now, the highest ever over the last decade or so, some 32%, and on the expanded definition, 42%, and unemployment continuing to grow. Our debt to GDP sitting at some 81.8%, and over the next few years, 3 to 4 years, could settle at around 88.8%. And so certainly our budget deficit as well, we have a budget deficit of some 500 billion rand and growing, expected to stabilize also over the medium term. But certainly the structural reforms that Operation Vulindlela and other government initiatives were supposed to help to kickstart the economy have not actually had any effect. If anything, it's the poorest of the poor that are being affected. A 10 rand increase in some of the social grants are just not going to cut it when so many have now become unemployed, poverty has increased, inequality has increased, and so this particular budget is definitely not a pro-poor budget.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wayne Trin from the ACDP, that giving us his take that he's not particularly happy about that particular, budget that was delivered by the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni. Up next, I have Dr. Xolani Mbanjwa, the commissar there of the, Economic Freedom Fighters. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Mbanjwa. Please give us your take as a party when it comes to this particular budget for 2021.
Well, the budget is a poor attempt which is not going to result in any structural reforms of the South African economy. What are these structural conditions of the South African economy? Is that majority of the wealth and economic activity benefits white people, the fact that there is chronic and rising unemployment that has characterized South Africa's economy for more than 3 decades. Nothing in the budget is going to change that reality. There is nothing or no promise that is going to result in more localization of production happening. So it is basically cognitive dissonance, the terrible attitude that the ANC government suffers of doing the same thing which does not work, and they keep doing it even if presented with evidence that it doesn't work. They insist on doing it. There was no mention at all of illicit financial flows, how you're going to deal with that. There's a lot of tax that is being drained by big corporations through all types of illegal activities. It's not just the tobacco industry. You're talking big corporations like mine in the mining industry, as well as auditing firms that are facilitating illicit financial flows out of the continent and out of South Africa. There's nothing in the budget that's going to result in a job for young black people tomorrow. There's nothing in the budget that is going to have us have any new economic activity. They are trying to go back to a pre-COVID-19 reality, which is basically no longer tenable.
Dr. Ndlozi, one of the highest highlights of this particular budget is the promise to actually stabilize debt, and that depends on a number of variables that Tito Mboweni has placed his trust on. At 88% stabilizing debt to GDP in 2025, do you think it's possible? And if so, what do you think is needed for that to be achieved?
Look, the reality is that you do need a demand boost type of activity if you're going to restart an economy. You shouldn't be worried about that, because the spin-offs of, particularly when demand boost happens in proper activities. You've got to release as much funds, but you've got to release them in ways that create economic activity that leads to sustainable jobs. You don't resist, you don't do budget austerity, you don't resist from spending. You push as much spending as possible, because that will have a spin-off down the line. 5-10 years, you'll have massive economic growth. You don't resist from spending. So the GDP debt ratio shouldn't be a big worry, shouldn't even be a big discussion if you're trying to restart an economy that has been devastated by COVID, but also that has been devastated over many years by the incompetent directionlessness of the African National Congress government.
Dr. Ndlozi, thank you very much for your time. It's highly appreciated. You heard there quite strong words coming from the EFF, on this particular budget. But next, we are talking to the man who's supposed to collect some of these monies, and that is Professor Edward Kisvete, of the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service. Professor Kisvete, thank you very much for joining us. A lot of, hope and a responsibility placed on your shoulders to actually collect more at a time when the revenue, the tax base is diminishing. And but that 3 billion rands that has been allocated to SARS should come in handy for you to execute your job in the medium term.
Yes, I think firstly to say that there must be lots of relief that there's no tax increases. In fact, the Minister announced today the 1% cut in CIT, which is not only a tax cut, it also has a multiplier effect in the economy, which is obviously good news. I think secondly, the fact that 2.2 billion will be going back into the hands of ordinary taxpayers, whilst it is balanced with the increase in the so-called sin taxes for those who choose to. It's a discretionary tax, and therefore I think it's the right kind of equity. In terms of where we're going, the rebuilding process of SARS has begun. As you heard today, it is a deep investment into expanding our data set, into building data science as a formal discipline using machine learning algorithms and AI. We can't do without that. We are ultimately about the manipulation of data. Obviously, in addition to that, our modernization has taken a bit of a lag in the last number of years, so we want to reinvest in the online platforms for both taxes and customs operations, and then deepening our skills. SARS has lost more than 2,000 people in the last 6 years, and we've not had the resources to replace all of them. And so in the investigative areas, in deep technical areas of complex financial arrangements, where transfer pricing, base erosion, and also evaluation abuse takes place, as well as going after the criminal economy. South Africa loses tens of billions of rands because of people who willfully and criminally defraud the system. So building our capability will help us to focus on that. And then, of course, today you also heard the announcement of a dedicated unit to respond to individuals with wealth and complex financial arrangements, including offshore arrangements, which often are masked. They're below the radar. And so regularizing that and ensuring that the taxes that are due from that are in fact collected. What is interesting is that for wealthy individuals, often a look at their statement of assets and liabilities says a lot more than an income statement, because many of them don't have a regular income like you and I have. They have income from other forms of economic activity, and often that's not always fully disclosed.
Going forward, it's going to be a tough one. Looking at what the Minister Mboweni said about the diminishing, revenue collection over the next couple of years, this particular new unit is going to be important. Is it also going to look at illicit financial flows that the EFF just spoke about?
Yeah, funds that leave South Africa illegally or in an illicit manner take place in a number of ways. The one area is what I call white-collar crime. It is when companies deliberately overstate transfers from local subsidiaries to offshore parent companies in the form of management fees or not having arm's length pricing agreements in place, and charging management fees and servicing loans that have no real commercial basis. We see a lot of that happening. So that's one way of getting money offshore in an illegal or in a way that is either aggressive or sailing very close to breaking the law. So we will look at that. Secondly, people retain money offshore literally by underdeclaring goods that they import, by manipulating the value of goods and mispricing trade. And then thirdly, we work in conjunction with the South African Reserve Bank to ensure that when companies who procure goods and services offshore and they get the approval by the Reserve Bank to pay an advance payment, as is often required, that then is reconciled with the goods that is imported, because very often you overstate the payment and it's in excess of the actual value of the goods, and that way you have created an outflow which is illicit.
Professor Kisveta, thank you very much for your time, and all the best for the near term and making sure that unit works. There is Professor Edward Kisveta talking to us about his plans to actually recapitalize the South African Revenue Service over the next term. And as you heard, Minister Tito Mboweni actually allocating an additional 3 billion rands to actually capacitize and rebuild the South African Revenue Service. This is the reaction from the parliamentary precinct. Back at you in studio.